Well, I hope we get to Micah, but we may not get to Micah today. But we have a problem when we come to the Old Testament. And I've already heard it in conversations after the service, right? Because we struggle with judgment. We struggle with the violence and the judgment in the Old Testament. And so most of the time I just stay away from it because it's hard to know what to do with it, right? Where do we put it? How do we look at that? We struggle with the retaliatory nature of the God of the Old Testament. And yet we want to be true to knowing that the Old Testament is God-breathed. It's Scripture. It's all God-breathed, right? And judgment's a funny thing because when we get to Micah, if we don't get it to some of it today, we'll get to it next week. But in Micah, we may actually like judgment because it's judgment against leaders who are corrupt. So we have this crazy tension around judgment and wrath and all of these things. And so as I was preparing for Micah, I did not like what I had prepared. I was struggling with the wrath and the judgment. And how do I contain that? How do I look at that? And how do I perceive that? So I spent the entire time of my study trying to understand how to look at this. And so I hope this is helpful to you and that you will read Micah and some of the other prophets with this lens. And that lens fits in my personal theme this year. So you guys, if you don't know Dennis, some of you were here for Dennis, and Dennis is amazing at having these pithy sayings. So he used to say, many voices, one message, right? The hushed sound of soft sandaled feet walking through the corridors of my heart, right? Right? They were these beautiful. So I have claimed my own ism, and it is this: making the invisible visible. You guys have heard us saying it actually this year. And I believe that that is actually what God is doing throughout Scripture. He is making the invisible visible. He is taking us and slowly revealing who He is through Scripture until we finally come to the pinnacle. And what's the pinnacle? The cross, right? Jesus. Jesus. Good answer. It's the Sunday school answer too, right? So you'll all get it. It's either the Bible or Jesus, I'm sure. And so we have this beautiful, actually, unveiling of who God is throughout Scripture. And so when we get to Jesus, we actually have to read backwards. We have to read Scripture through the lens of who Jesus is, because does God change? Did God change in my life from the time that I was a single divorced man when He met me in holy laughter to the time that I was married with kids and spoke to me through an inmate to now when I'm in this community and He speaks to me through others who dream dreams and have visions? Did God change? Who changed? I changed. I had more of God revealed to me in my life. And some of you, I don't know if you're struggling with this, so let's just look at some Bible passages. Hebrews 1:1-4 says this: long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now in these final days, He has spoken to us through His Son. God promised everything to the Son as an inheritance, and through the Son, He created the universe. And here's the clincher. The Son radiates God's glory and expresses the very character of God, and He sustains everything by the mighty power of His command. I'm going to read that part again. The Son radiates God's glory and expresses the very character of God, and He sustains everything by His mighty power. He radiates God's glory and expresses the very character of God. He is the character of God. This is why when we say God, Jesus, the Logos, the image, He is the image of God. So when we need to find out what our image of God is, we look to Jesus. If you're still struggling with this thought, because I know some people do, what does Paul the Apostle say about this? He sees Jesus as the pinnacle of the revelation of God. So much so that in 1 Corinthians he says, I decided that while I was with you, I would preach nothing but Christ and Him crucified. Nothing. Now, I don't know what you guys know about Paul, but Paul knew a whole lot. He was probably the most learned writer of the Bible. He knew all the stories. He knew, and he said he would preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. Funny that later on, the father of Protestantism, Martin Luther, said this: "He who would read the Bible must simply take heed that he does not err. For the scripture may permit itself to be stretched and led, but let no one lead it according to his own inclinations, but let him lead it to its source. That is the cross of Christ. Then he will surely strike the center." I'm caught here. So this is actually not a new thought. It's funny that we are sometimes struggle with this. And I've heard people struggling it with me and with others. If God doesn't change, and if Jesus is the fullness of God in the body, then Jesus' character is God's character. Is that right? Does that make sense? And so when we talk about Jesus, when I think about Jesus' character, what are some of the things that his character are? You can yell them out if you want. Compassion. Merciful. We love these ones, right? Just. Yeah, just. Sorry, loving? Awesome. What else? Humble. Sorry? Non-violent. Interesting. Thank you for that one. Illustrates my point really well. Patient. Oh, tenacious. Nice. Kind. All of those are true. The one character that I think we can focus on as we read these scriptures is that is all his character, but his other character is that he's willing to stoop down. He's willing to meet us in the sin, right? I find it funny that Jesus was called a glutton and a drunkard. He was not afraid to be identified with things that we think are not good. He steps into the world, into the mess. That is his whole mission, to step into the world, into our mess, so that he can meet us where we're at. And this, incarnation we call it, right? God stepping into our world to meet us where we are at. If it's Christ's character, it's also God's character, because he is the fullness of God. So why would we be surprised when God enters into the time and the place of a warring tribal people? Right? What we see in the Old Testament, what we're afraid to talk about. And there are horrible things there. Terrible slaughters and judgments that we just don't understand. But God enters into our mess, our violence, our sin, even as Jesus does as he's revealed. And he does it because he loves us, because he knows it's the only way we can meet him, because he's beyond us. And so as I approach the minor prophets, we've gone through quite a few, but as I approach Micah, I come with this thought process, that God is revealing himself, but his character stays the same. And so we need to remember that his character is Jesus. And I approach it somewhat like a detective, which kind of makes it fun, right? As we're searching these scriptures where we see an angry, wrathful God, we need to look for clues that point to Jesus and the cross, right? And not just around the prophecy of his reign and the future, because we like some of those things, right? We love streets of gold and crystal seas and all of those things. But even just points to his character. And so for me, this has made reading the prophets and the Old Testament much more enjoyable. Helps me to understand better. And I'm able to somewhat make the invisible visible. Now, in case you're still struggling with this, I look for patterns a little bit. And so what I started trying to work out was, where is this evident in the Bible? And I think it's evident right at the beginning. You guys know I always go back to the creation story, right? And whether you think it's 7 days or not, that's irrelevant to me. I like that we have both sides of that conversation here. I like that we're diverse in our thinking. But if we look at creation, we have this beautiful thing unfolding. And It's the revealing of God and of God's nature, at least in my mind. So day one, what happens? God creates light and dark, land and universe, right? And in that, we could say that we see God's transcendent character. He is massive. The universe, all the planets. Like, I don't think he's talking about the earth and sky that we're talking about. We're talking about earths and skies. Hundreds of thousands of them. That's day one, and we see the transcendent God. He's revealed. And so that's day one and day two. On day three and day four, and even day five, we have land and water, which give birth to trees and plants, sun and moon, animal life. And what do we see in God's nature being revealed? We see that he gives light and he gives life. So we start with this transcendent, massive God who gives life, and then we come to the pinnacle of creation, which seems weird as I'm standing here to say that I am the pinnacle of God's creation. But we are the pinnacle of God's creation. God says, I make man in my own image. In the image I created him. Them, let's say. And what is revealed as God creates? People. That he is relational. That is the core of who God is. It's revealed in the Trinity, right? The entire essence of God, and we get to this later in 1 John where it says, anyone who loves is of God because God is love, right? He is a relational God. And so even in the creation story, we see this slow progression of the revealed God. And so I would suggest that you can read the Bible this way, that this is a way for you to help to understand how God is portrayed differently because he enters into our story and allows us to enter into his story. The great thing is that Micah is actually a book that points both figuratively and literally to Jesus. In chapter 5, we come to this beautiful section. And I'm going to read it to you. Micah 5, 2-6. But you, O Bethlehem, are only a small village among the people of Judah. Yet a ruler of Israel, whose origins are from the distant past, will come to you on my behalf. The people of Israel will be abandoned to their enemies until the woman in labor gives birth. Then at last his fellow countrymen will return from exile to their homeland, and he will stand to lead his flock with the Lord's strength and in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Then the people will live there undisturbed, for he will be highly honored among the world, and he will be the source of peace. And we know, and the scholars confirm, that this is pointing to the Messiah. So I'm going to challenge you this week that you read Micah with this thought that God is revealing himself, but you need to hold it up to the standard of Christ. So I have a few minutes left. We're going to ask questions at the end, but I'm going to give you a quick overview of Micah before we do questions. So, the book of Micah. Micah is a short name. It's like me, some people call me KP, or PK, right? Because that's Pastor Kevin, and I really don't like the title pastor, so some people here call me PK. That is the same as Micah's name. I won't even pronounce it for you. It's a longer name. But you know what it means? It means who is like Yahweh. And Yahweh is the name that the Jews use for God. And Micah is called the prophet of the poor. So we will hopefully love this message he delivers. And the other thing that we know about Micah is that he delivered his message with tears. There's actually whole parts of his prophecy when he talks about the condemnation and judgment where he weeps, which is how a prophet should speak if there's condemnation and judgment. We know that Micah lived about the same time as Isaiah. In fact, they think that they may have borrowed some of the sayings from each other. That is possible. Micah was in the southern kingdom, Isaiah in the northern kingdom. And that's another thing that we know is that Israel was divided in two. There was the northern kingdom, and Samaria was the capital. And then the southern kingdom was, the capital was Jerusalem. And there are many themes in Micah, but most of them are about justice, which someone said is Christ's nature this morning, just. Forgiveness. And at the end of every part of judgment, there is a part of hope. There is a pointing to restoration. There is a huge push in Micah about moral behavior, and we'll talk for a second on moral behavior, maybe next week. I won't maybe talk about that today. But it is about leaders who steal, lie, and murder to oppress others. And so he does talk about moral behavior. And I just want to suggest to you that we talk about righteousness, but do we know what righteousness is? Because that's usually what we're talking about with moral behavior. I'm not sure that's true, although it leads to moral behavior. But righteousness means one who is right. And in the context of a God who has the same character as Christ and who has the character of being a relational God, that means being right relationship. So righteousness is being right with God. And so next week, we will talk about Micah and an overview of that.